Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China. The program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Being live, we ask that if you have any questions, please use the chat box on the right of your screen to ask them, and we will try and get to as many of them as we possibly can. The new geopolitical development will have a significant impact on the direction of the US-China relationship, and we intend to increasingly include it in our program. A vitally important part of the Global South is Africa, and we have with us today someone who knows it well, especially its strategic and commercial importance. Dr. Maria Repnikova is a scholar of Chinese politics and an associate professor of global communication at Georgia State University. Her research focuses on domestic and global public opinion management, including critical journalism and internal propaganda. She recently wrote most recently, she's focused on China's soft power in Africa. She's widely published in major media outlets such as the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and the Wall Street Journal. Maria's book, Media Politics in China, Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism, won the Book of the Year award from the International Journal of Press and Politics. Please welcome Dr. Maria Repnikova.
Good morning, Sarwar. Thank you for having me.
Good morning, Maria. Thank you for taking the time to be on Polaris Live. I want to start by asking you, this is the 10th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, President Xi Jinping's trillion-dollar project to build infrastructure in Asia, Europe, and Africa, win hearts and minds, resources, business of a large part of the world. Now, you've studied the BRI up close in Africa. How's it doing there?
Yes, the BRI indeed is approaching its 10-year anniversary, and there's a lot of discussion about the efficacy of this project and whether or not it's shifting gears towards something else. So I think before going to specific projects that I've been looking at least indirectly in Ethiopia, I wanted to just mention that the BRI itself is really transforming from a very large-scale lending project to something that's probably going to be much more focused and much smaller scale in terms of how much money is being invested and where. And some latest data is quite revealing. For example, there's a report that came out recently from the University of Toronto that was specifically focusing on Kenya. And the author of this report found that the lending that's part of BRI projects to Kenya is diminishing dramatically. For example, this coming year, they're expecting only 5% of lending that was given the previous year. So really, there's just an increasing diminished kind of lending and financing that's attributed to BRI projects all across the board. So that's just something that's, I think, important to note, that the financing is transforming, and perhaps the Chinese government itself is starting to rethink, very much rethink what this is all about. And shifting just a little bit to the specific case that I was looking at in Ethiopia, even though most of my focus was on soft power initiatives, education, elite trainings, and so forth, the BRI projects are still very much at the center of China's relationship with Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is one of its most strategic partners. So I did get to observe some of the projects, like the light rail. It's basically a metro system that goes across the whole city of Addis Ababa. There's also the Djibouti Railway, a number of highways, and other projects that have been constructed with the large-scale lending from China and construction carried out by Chinese companies. But what I found was that there's kind of a mixed success rate, right? Some projects are doing better than others. Addis Light Rail, for instance, is a fascinating case study because over time, at least half of the trains are no longer working. So it used to, they used to have, for example, 40 trains, but now, depending on who you talk to, the estimate is that maybe 20 of them work, maybe 10 of them work. So there's this kind of a decline in quality, which a lot of officials and various people I interviewed talk about. And there is not enough money to buy the parts that are needed to make this work from China. So there's this, kind of on a micro level, we see some struggles when it comes to maintaining projects, even if they already exist. But when we look at financing, once again, Ethiopia has also not received additional loans from China in recent years. And some of it is also the initiative of the Ethiopian government. They say they don't want to have as much debt, so they're not borrowing as much. But, that's a debatable question, to what extent is China not lending versus the other country not asking for the money. But either way, something is clearly transforming when it comes to BRI.
Hmm. When you mention the lack of the number of trains running, is there any evidence as to what causes that? Is it the Chinese didn't do a good job of training? Is it that the Ethiopian government doesn't have enough money to buy spare parts? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this question is a little bit sensitive because, depending on who you ask, they'll have very different responses to why this is not working, why it's working this way. So one of the major issues concerns the spare parts that you've mentioned, not having enough money to purchase spare parts. And of course, in Ethiopia, there's been also a foreign currency crisis, which means that there's not enough currency to purchase things from the outside, or not enough dollar currency. So that means that a lot of these purchases have been stalled. So there's not enough financing to get them. In recent agreements with Chinese governments, there are some ways to, or some attempts to ameliorate that, to get those spare parts. But in my discussions, I found that that's a big issue. The maintenance issue is a major concern. And of course, some officials might say in Ethiopia that maybe the quality should have been higher to begin with. Others might say that perhaps the quality was okay to start with, but over time the projects deteriorate and they require maintenance on a regular basis, something that the budgets don't allocate enough money for.
Wow. So, just one country in Africa out of 54, Nigeria, will have a larger consumer class than the US in 2 decades, according to the American Chamber of Commerce. Now, China is helping Africa become the next factory of the world to take advantage of this consumer demand that is coming around the corner. How did the US fall behind in this enormous emerging commercial opportunity, Maria? Any thoughts?
Well, I think what China offers is a little bit, or very difficult to compete with them in many ways. China is exporting, first of all, items and merchandise at very large scale. It's setting up mega projects, right? At least up until recently, the BRI, as I mentioned, is changing into something perhaps more narrow scaled or more micro scaled even. But for a long time, it's been this mega projects, mega construction projects, factories. Industrial parks are very important to mention because they house a lot of these companies. You're talking about this thriving younger population. Many of these people will be working for some of these industrial parks and initiatives. And of course, many entrepreneurs are coming from China independently of the state. So we often think of
Right.
Chinese government as, it's kind of monolithic and it's controlling everything. But in reality, millions of people from China are coming on their own and setting up their own businesses and various enterprising initiatives. So I think there's a lot of dynamism, and the scale of engagement. What China is offering is in some ways rooted in China's own system, right? Its own domestic system, its economic development system, its construction advantages when it comes to infrastructure building, something that the U.S. In a particular sphere cannot quite compete with. So I think part of that is also competitive advantage that China has over the U.S. when it comes to some of these engagements up until now.
And that explains, I think, the interview a American government official had with an African government official, and the African said, "Listen, when China comes here, we get an airport. When you guys come here from America, what we get is a speech." And did you pick that up? Because I think that also relates to the fact that people talk about a Washington consensus, that we also need. We also try to focus on principles and morality and governance, and China does not. Is that how this relates? This particular quote?
I do find quite a bit of cynicism when it comes to discussions of the United States in general and U.S. policy towards Africa in particular. During my field work, some of these quotes that the kind of quote that you just related did come up in my research as well. This idea that China comes with something tangible, airports, all kinds of construction projects, railroads, highways, you name it, right? But the U.S. is not as visible. You just don't see it. It's not as visceral, but the speeches are indeed quite moralistic. They concern higher ideals, human rights, and all sorts of forms of advice and kind of guidance for these countries, how to become the more idealized form of democracy, the better forms of themselves. So I think that is something that definitely comes up in discussions. The critique of cynicism, but also it's worth noting that this is also rooted in this idea that the U.S. is often perceived as having double standards, right? That in some cases it's very much concerned about human rights, in other cases it's not. So there's this perception that it's a selective human rights kind of concern or commitment, and as a result, the critique is not taken as seriously. So I think it's something worth also thinking about. is the US consistent when it comes to sending its message about ideals and values?
Okay. Uh, I wanted to just say, Maria, that I noticed a slight technical issue with
Oh,
the screen freezing. I don't think that that's going to be in the transmission. I think it's just on our side. But I just wanted you to know that we just need to keep going on. I think
okay.
it's recording just fine. But in the same uh, area, there's another point I wanted to ask you about, which has to do with the importance of manufacturing. I mean, a lot of economists say that yes, it's good to talk about robots and artificial intelligence and so on, but ultimately it's people making things, developing countries making things, which is how they jack themselves up as China did. So there's a McKinsey report that says China 20 years ago made one investment in Africa, right? Today they have over 1,000. So again, does this go back to some of the basic beliefs, Ray, American aid, that we need to focus on capitalism and a lot of other things, but not the root manufacturing process? Do you think we're missing the boat on that?
Well, it's a bit of a complicated question because it depends on how we measure the outcomes of these manufacturing investments and initiatives. And this is still, of course, ongoing, so we don't have as much data yet to understand, is it really empowering these countries as much as maybe was anticipated to be, or are there also disadvantages to these manufacturing commitments? So when it comes to manufacturing investments to these industrial parks, for instance, a lot of these productions are, they're catered towards the audience overseas, or the target consumers are all abroad, and oftentimes the companies operating from the industrial parks are also not, for instance, in this case, Ethiopia, they're also Chinese, sometimes European. So I
Right.
guess the question is, who's really earning here? Who is being empowered? I mean, the workers that are hired, from my research and from what I've heard from those studying it very closely, they're paid extremely low wages. So a lot of it is, labor that one could argue is kind of exploitative. But at the same time, some of these individuals would not find other work otherwise. So they are gaining something that they maybe wouldn't gain in other sectors in their home country, but it's still extremely underpaid labor. So I guess one has to kind of take that into account, thinking to what extent that's really an empowering boom or not. And of course, it's also how consistent, how long term is it? Because once the country at stake, in this case, let's say Ethiopia, is facing a security crisis as it has in recent years, some of these firms also shut down, some of these parks are less active, and then they have to kind of restart again. So the instability, right, the political instability, economic instability, to what extent it kind of ends up making these enterprises more fragile. But certainly, I think overall investment in manufacturing is a great thing. And again, it's how to attract companies from the US, for instance, to invest in that kind of sector, because a lot of this is high risk. So Chinese companies often take much higher risk than American counterparts. So how to get them to come there, I think that's a big issue when it comes to acknowledging and accepting a relatively high amount of risk.
I wanted to just remind our viewers that Polaris.live.com is totally viewer supported. You can help us grow by subscribing to our YouTube channel and by signing up for our newsletter. So let me get back to our guest. Maria, thank you for that. We may have to do some technical editing to make continuity, but I want to continue on because this is much too important an interview in today's world. So I want to ask you, do you think America focuses too much on military initiatives in developing countries like Africa, not enough on increasing standards of living? Do you think there's some of that going on?
Well, I think in general, when it comes to the US global strategy, whether it's in Africa or global South at large, and just in the world, if we take it at a macro scale, the US does focus a lot on military and defense sector. That's where most of the investment goes when it comes to the funding provided, right, to engage overseas, and a lot less funding is available for other types of projects, especially the kinds of things that interest me, is like education investments, exchanges, trainings, capacity building in the journalistic sphere, for instance, in governance. I mean, of course, there are some amazing programs being carried out, but the funding for that is significantly much, it's really minuscule in comparison to defense departments funding, for instance, or security apparatus at large. So I do think that there's a huge imbalance. And if there was a slight rebalancing in the direction of these other initiatives, non-military initiatives and engagements, I think that the US would reap a lot of rewards from that.
Along the same lines, we always use the word soft power, winning hearts and minds. Uh, China works through also the Confucius Institutes. Can you try and explain, link these things? What are these Confucius Institute that China sets up?
Sure. So, for the viewers who are not familiar with this term at all, Confucius Institutes, they're essentially cultural institutes that teach Chinese language and culture to various students of different ages. Some of them are high school students, some of them are university students. Sometimes they also have classes for adults and workers, employees of Chinese companies, and so forth. But the reason why they become controversial and why maybe some of the viewers have seen that name pop up in the news recently is that they've been mostly, or at least largely, shut down when it comes to the US context. So here in the United States, there were over 100 of these institutes present across American campuses, some high schools as well, but essentially universities have been the big point of controversy, and a lot of complaints and investigations have come about, including from the FBI, about the potential for ideological infiltration, surveillance, and other, malign kind of influence that may come out of these institutes. And as a result, a lot of universities have even preemptively shut them down. They're just, awaiting the potential investigation. They decided just to close down the institute. So it's been a pretty dramatic story in the context of the United States, but also we've seen some similar things happening in Canada, in Western Europe, and essentially across Western liberal democracies. So that's been the story of Confucius Institutes in this context. Why are they seen as potentially so damaging? In part because up until recently, they've been run by essentially Chinese Communist Party. The Ministry of Education played a huge part in that. They're state-sponsored, and they pay for the teachers who are coming over here to the United States or other countries to teach Chinese. But the concern was, are they teaching something else? Is there kind of political influence involved there? Are they censoring information? Will some of them be spies? So because of these concerns, we've seen a real kind of reshuffling of this initiative and a shrinkage of this initiative. But it's important to add that that's not the case in other contexts, right? We're talking about Africa today and about the global South. In the context of Africa, Confucius Institutes, again, these cultural institutes that teach Chinese language and culture, are still quite popular and dynamic. And one of the reasons, something I write about in my work as well, is that they often are tied to employment. So they don't just teach Chinese, they also offer jobs at Chinese companies for young students, university students. So the way that they attract people to come to this institute in the first place is by saying, well, we can basically help you get a job at a Chinese company as a translator, and some of them are also getting jobs in more technical spheres, and these are fairly well-paid jobs in comparison to the wages in the country that are given in other sectors. So it's really quite an attractive opportunity, and as a result, some of these institutes are thriving in Africa in comparison to the US, where most of them have been now shut down.
Mm. Well, it's really interesting because many of the great powers, as they got richer, set up institutes like the Confucius Institutes, right? I mean, the French have the Alliance Française all over the world, the Goethe Institute of Germany. And so this isn't anything new that the Chinese started, but it's the difference that the Chinese try to expand their remit of these institutes and get into more spying, or is it simply a feeling on the Western side that this is something that China is doing that we should not allow?
Yeah, so this idea that there's more spying or that there's somehow more politically controversial, it's been widely debated, and we don't have enough empirical evidence, I think, to demonstrate that indeed the majority of institutes in the US have been spying, or that there's a surveillance, censorship. Even if you think about censorship, it's not so much spying, but just controlling information in the classrooms. We don't have enough studies to really showcase that, yes, this is taking place across all these institutes, or even most of these institutes. One exceptional book that I always recommend by Professor Jennifer Hubbard, about Confucius Institutes, that's really an in-depth study of this phenomena in American high schools. It shows that, if anything, Chinese teachers, they're not talking about some of these sensitive issues. So basically, they'll avoid talking about Tibet, they won't talk about Xinjiang, they won't talk about democracy in China. So they're avoiding this kind of issues altogether. But the reaction from American parents has been that, oh, that's also, because they're hiding something. There's some kind of concealment happening. Why aren't they talking about them? So if they're not talking about them, it's also a form of some kind of a covert operation or something suspicious. But in her study, she found that it's not so much kind of indoctrination or teaching students how to think about China in this politicized kind of form, but just avoiding very sensitive issues altogether. So I think that's in part, I think, because Chinese institutes and any kind of soft power operations, they're very decentralized. You have these teachers who are coming over. For them, it's really a chance to see America, to learn English, to kind of expose themselves to a different culture. They're very excited to come here. So they're trying to be cautious not to destabilize this opportunity. So if they're talking
Right.
about sensitive issues, they might get in trouble with whoever is, their leaders or bosses back in China. So they're basically attempting to kind of present this as really just a cultural endeavor. Like we're learning about Confucius Institutes, Confucius himself, right, Chinese philosopher, ancient philosopher, but also about all kinds of ceremonies, like how to make Chinese tea or, paper scissor ceremonies, Chinese dancing, martial arts. They're teaching very much kind of traditional forms of Chinese culture, which are in some ways not that lively anymore, practiced even within China, but more kind of traditional, old school, historical forms of thinking about Chinese culture. And of course, teaching language, how to speak Chinese. And then as a result, being able to
Right.
be, part of Chinese society at some point. So I think this, in some ways, these allegations, they're also very much driven by the political sentiment in the United
Ah,
States, right? That's increasingly anti-China, and everything that comes from China, especially with sponsored by the Chinese state, is seen as extremely suspicious and potentially not just suspicious but harmful. There's a harmful dimension to it, and I think we have to be cautious, but it's also important to rely on facts and to be more, I guess, as a researcher, to be more empirical when it comes to analyzing these initiatives, as opposed to kind of dismissing them or even treating them as these extremely malign operations firsthand, right? We have to be a little bit cautious about discerning between different ones
right.
and just trying to understand them better, as opposed to just kind of shutting them down altogether. That's my sense.
I'm just curious, is there a Confucius Institute in the Atlanta area?
There used to be one at Georgia State. It was quite active, but it has been closed. It's been
Ah,
shut down. Yeah. So
okay.
that this is definitely affecting the situation here. And I think the alternative, I guess, the what follows is that we need more funding into divested into these language study initiatives. So if it's not coming from elsewhere, from the outside, the U.S. government needs to fund Chinese language courses or other foreign language courses. And I think some of it is happening, but I wonder how much of it is happening. Is it enough to sponsor the next generation of Chinese language speakers in the
Yes.
U.S.? Are there enough students who want to even learn it? What are we seeing on this front? I think it's also very important as we continue to think about this relationship. Who are going to be the individuals? What's the next generation of, I guess, leaders, but also just young people who are actually engaging with the country? I think that's really crucial.
Indeed, and I think it's becoming more crucial every day because, in the Middle East now, in the UAE and other progressive countries, beginning in kindergarten, now learning Mandarin is compulsory.
Right.
So they are pumping all of this future thinking in the Middle East, and certainly people like you ought to try and influence what we do here. So I just wanted to throw that out. But I want to, ask you: do you see any evidence of BRI and China's soft power in the Caribbean, our backyard?
Yes, there are a lot of projects that have been launched in the Caribbean, and I think that's also the region that's been a little bit underestimated or maybe less in the news when it comes to competition between U.S. and China. For some reasons, I think Africa has come up as the most sensitive, contentious region when it comes to competing with China in the global south. But Caribbean is right here, right? Because it's in a backyard, but there's been a lot less conversations about that. But China has been investing a lot, building a lot of projects, and essentially extending the same tools, same toolkit that it's used in Africa in the Caribbean. So I think it's a really important region to watch and to engage with more closely, and to understand much better, much more deeply what China is doing.
And regarding what they're doing, is it ports? Is it shipping? Is it just building trade? Do you have any idea? Do we know what's happening?
I haven't studied the Caribbean closely in terms of the types of projects that China is working on, but I know that infrastructure is a huge part of it, whether it's ports or roads or other projects. That's been basically the hallmark of BRI. It's always somehow related to infrastructure, and as I mentioned, nowadays it's shifting towards smaller scale projects and maybe more high tech projects as well. So we might see a big change in that. But up until now, infrastructure has been the main source of collaboration investment.
Along the same lines, any evidence yet that during the COVID times, China provided a lot of assistance? Did China earn a lot of gold stars during the pandemic time for providing assistance to developing countries, BRI countries?
Well, it certainly tried to earn as many gold stars as possible through its initiatives, including provision of PPE equipment, vaccines, and a lot of it was accompanied by big media campaigns, trying to make this very visible and kind of publicizing what it's doing widely. I think China does a lot of publicizing work that I think the US actually doesn't do as much of. So in addition to providing something, they do a lot of campaigning, PR and so forth. But I think the gold stars it earned in reality are kind of mixed, or maybe not quite as many as they hoped for, in part because associations of these various provisions are often linked to low quality or insufficient quality. So when you ask someone if they can choose between Chinese or China-made vaccine and vaccine made in Europe or the United States, they often would go for, I think most likely would go for the latter. They wouldn't choose the Chinese vaccine. So the quality associations are still very much at the heart of this perceptions of China is maybe not quite providing as good of a thing, right? So if there's no choice, they will take the Chinese vaccine. But if there's a choice, they will try to get something else coming from the West. So I think that's also an important dimension and something that I think China struggles with when it comes to its soft power, trying to kind of compete on this quality domain, not only scale of provisions.
Okay. And I can't help but, before we run out of time, ask you, you're an expert on communications, right? Political communications, authoritarian. How would you compare America's and China's communication policies, raise soft power and helping development and so on?
Well, I think they're so different that comparisons can be a little bit challenging to make because they're very different political systems, right? So they have very different resources and limitations. So I think one thing that's important maybe to note is that I just mentioned campaigning or publicizing initiatives. That's something I also heard a lot from U.S. officials, including embassy officials, that China somehow is doing it better, or they have a lot more visibility. They're good at placing their labels on everything they're doing. So they're essentially very much present. And going back to the quote you brought up at the beginning of our chat from this official who mentioned that, we have roads or airports from China, right, and nothing from the US. Part of it is also just that it's very much visible initiatives accompanied by very visible marking. So if you see Chinese project, you will never confuse it for something that's not Chinese because you have labels and huge posters all over it. So it's very clear that this is definitely coming from China. So if you walk around Addis Ababa, you will definitely notice that a construction project, you might think, oh, it could be a local project, it could be Turkish, right? It could be American company. No, it's definitely Chinese because you can see it from very far away. You will see Chinese characters and China, slogans. So I think that definitely differentiates some of these communication strategies of China versus the US, which sometimes is more subtle, sometimes more cautious. And also, interestingly, when I was talking to US officials, they brought up the fact that some Chinese officials, especially ambassadors, are recently really actively tweeting, right, on social media. They're expressing all kinds of personal views, or at least they're kind of sharper, sometimes a little bit more maybe assertive than, let's say, a US ambassador would be on Twitter. And when I asked them, how is it different for the US, they mentioned that the US has to go through, or the US officials have to go through a lot of requirements and sort of checks about what they can tweet. So they have to go through all kinds of kind of rights of approval before the tweet even goes out, whereas it seems like for some Chinese officials, maybe this approval is actually less burdensome, which is kind of surprising given that, you would think it's the opposite. So some of these things can be like the bureaucracy, right? It's sometimes weighs the US maybe in a heavier direction than maybe China is. But at the same time, when it comes to media, of course, US media outlets are, at least for the most part, independent from the state. They're commercialized. They tell dynamic stories. They're livelier, and they often try to really appeal to the audience. Let's say Chinese media is state-owned. So they have a very specific agenda. They're state-sponsored, and they're censored a lot more heavily. So depending on the instrument we're looking at, we might find more impediments on one side versus the other. If I think social media, ambassadors tweeting, maybe China seems to be a little bit more loose in this respect. When it comes to state media or traditional media, Chinese media might be a lot more constrained. So a lot of distinctions based on different tools that they're deploying, but both of them face their own distinctive barriers or challenges.
Well, listen, Dr. Repnikova, we have run out of time. I could talk to you all day, and I think our viewers would like to listen to you all day. So you have to promise to come back. But I want to thank you, really thank you, for taking the time today, and really appreciate your coming on Polaris Live.
Thank you very much, Sarwar, for having me. And it's my pleasure to be here for the first time, and I look forward to more returns.
Thank you. So we have, unfortunately, as I mentioned, run out of time. And I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Please join us again next week for another episode of Polaris Live. And on that episode, we will have Mr. Noel Latif, the president of the Foreign Policy Association, and he wants to talk to about his very important organization and how it's going to deal with the world as it transforms from two superpowers into a host of other powers, and how that changes the education and information that is provided by the Foreign Policy Association. So join us then. Until then, goodbye.